Don't let rampant politics and clusterfuckery ruin all your projects and your sanity. Smooth ugly penny lines and make it all make sense. Get experience by osmosis here on Corporate Underpants.
My song. I love my song. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Corporate Underpants Live. We are recording live here this March 27th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And I'm Tamara Adlin. I'm your host and the creator of Corporate Underpants. And I'm so glad you could join me and my fabulous guest for this fabulous interview on alignment, my favorite topic in the whole wide world. If you've been tuning in, you know that I just released a recording of my conversation with Melissa Fell. She is the co-author with my guest today, Bruce McCarthy, of the book Aligned that came out and blew my brains out because it was amazing and also upsetting because I wanted to be the first one to write about Aligned. But actually, it turned out to be great because they are doing such great work, Melissa and Bruce, and their book to bring this topic to light in our fields of product, which Bruce is a genius at in product and product management, in UX, which, yeah, sure, I'm a genius at, and in design, and basically in any corporate role where you are seeking seniority in your world, in your work, and you're realizing that staying out of politics is not an option. And so what happens when you realize that staying out of politics is not an option? And as I'll talk about with Bruce today, it's also for corporate leaders who are feeling like you're in an insolvable puzzle with your colleagues and your leadership team. There is hope, and there are so many new ideas coming out right now in history to help you with those problems. And so without further ado, I am going to bring onto the stage, ladies and gentlemen, Bruce McCarthy.
Hi, Tamara.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad
Good.
to be here. And I'm glad you picked this topic because, like you said, I think it's important, not talked about enough, and really timely.
Yes, show us the book. Show us the
Well, yeah.
fabulous book.
So Melissa and I wrote this book called Aligned: Stakeholder Management for Product Leaders. But to tell you the truth, the feedback that we're getting is that it applies to everybody in business. It's our background, Melissa and me, been in product for many years, and it's a particular challenge for product leaders to drive that alignment. As you said, the further you get up in the organization, the more important it becomes. But it's the hidden side of all of our jobs. It's like coming up, we learn skills, we learn how to make a roadmap, we learn how to prioritize, we learn how to do customer discovery, we learn how to do all the mechanical parts of our job. But none of that really matters if we don't have the team behind us, if we're not all on the same page about where we're going and why we're doing stuff.
Yeah, the analogy I use for that listeners are familiar with is that we're all focused here on building the house, and if tornadoes come through, it doesn't matter how good we are at building the perfect product roadmap and using the
Right.
perfect template and getting the perfect data, because a tornado, which comes from Mount Olympus and the warring gods on Mount Olympus, demolishes all of that. So there's a point in your career where you realize, oh, I have gotten as good as I can be at writing this kind of document, at getting this kind of data, at understanding the problems, and it doesn't matter. So now what?
Yeah. When you've been hit by the executive tornado enough times, you begin to come to the conclusion that either you're just doomed and you should give up, or hopefully instead, you got to figure out how to manage the tornado. You got to figure
Exactly.
out, how do I actually make sure that the things that we're working on are lined up with the priorities of the powers that be, with the goals of the organization. And when the tornado comes, you can be in a position to sidestep it by saying, we all agreed, you and me and the rest of the executive team, that X, Y, and Z were priorities for good reasons because they will drive the future of the company. Is this emergency really actually more important than any of that stuff? And maybe the answer is no, or maybe it really is yes, in which case you actually would agree with making a change.
And I'm glad the tornado analogy resonates for you. I, of course, am in love with my own ideas, so it resonates for me. But one of the things I think about the tornado is that for a long time, I think many of us felt we just wanted to get better in our processes, right? We wanted to get better at building the house.
Better at the job.
Those come through. You either decide that we can't control the weather and you just give up and complain about the executive team or whatever, or you try to figure out how to manage the weather, which is extremely daunting because that's like you or me saying, oh, I'm going to control the tornadoes, prevent the tornadoes, or tornado proof
Sounds
my
impossible,
house.
right?
And how do you do that?
It turns out it is actually possible, even though so maybe that's where the tornado analogy breaks down, or
Yeah.
maybe that's where it's useful because I can imagine a blog headline of how to control tornadoes or how to not just predict, but actually control the weather. And that sounds impossible enough that maybe I would read it.
Yeah.
But it turns out it is possible. In the book, for example, we describe a process whereby our product management leader hero in the book, Irie, discovers that the executive team and the company as a whole are not aligned on objectives, that it's a random walk of different siloed objectives, and deliberately puts together a process for bringing the right people to the table in the right way, and bringing out where they disagree. She does this thing called mining for conflict,
Yeah.
where she actually tries to get people to say the what out loud where they disagree with each other. And then she captains a process for reconciling those things and for coming to some sort of common understanding. And they end up in the book, and I've seen this happen in the real world too, they end up deciding they're going to focus on A and not on B, even though there've been a bunch of roadmap things around B for a while.
I'm really glad you brought up, of course, you brought up Irie. Irie is the sort of main character in the fable that goes through your entire book. And by the way, my favorite business books of all time have all had an actual story in them. So I love that you did that. It's also a great argument for the value of personas
Yep.
because people can relate to Irie in a way that it's harder to relate to scenario one or whatever.
Well, our product management background is showing here, obviously.
Yeah, of course. And it worked. And then the other thing that's interesting is the way the tornado analogy doesn't break down is if you do play on that idea of the Greek gods, and tornadoes and lightning come from Zeus and Poseidon arguing with each other. And
Right?
the impact of that really has the biggest impact on the mere mortals who are just trying to go about their day. So once lightning is in the air, you can't stop it. But maybe, just maybe, if you could calm down Poseidon and Zeus,
You could prevent it.
you could prevent it in the first place, which is exactly the idea behind
That's a,
alignment. However, Poseidon and Zeus are notoriously difficult to reason with.
they have their, despite them both saying that they're being perfectly reasonable and rational, they have their passions, right? They have their personal individual interests and their conflicting motivations.
And they have the validation of holding the roles that they hold. So they are the gods, right? And in corporate world, they are the one who was hired into the senior level position for some reason about the value of their decision making, the value of their perspective, and all of those things may not always be true that they have the perspective that we would hope that they have, but they have some. And so just going in and saying that whatever they think is irrelevant or they need to start from scratch, it just doesn't work.
No, what I often find is that there's a lack of empathy among people who disagree, that they're not actually, it's not that they couldn't understand or appreciate someone else's point of view. It's that they don't try.
They don't try.
They
Say
don't,
more about that.
they
Tell us
don't,
about that.
often I find people will state an opinion as though it were a fact. And when you press them on it, their first response is, it's obvious. And then you say, okay, but what evidence do you have? And it turns out it's anecdotal at best, or it's based on previous experience over years, but not based on today's reality. And so when someone comes in with a contradictory opinion and they're speaking to someone higher in the corporate hierarchy, their first reaction when someone says something as fact is just to take them at their word and not press. And so the right conversation, even if this person lesser placed in the hierarchy has conflicting information, is that information never sees the light of day because they're afraid to say anything. And they walk away thinking that this executive is an idiot or irrational, when in fact, they're just basing their opinion on gut. And I don't know, we've all kind of been trained to state things as firmly as possible, despite a lack of evidence. My mom used to say about my dad that he was seldom right, but never in doubt.
Oh God, I'm not gonna touch that with a 10-foot pole. Okay, but let's talk about the word information for a minute, right?
Yeah.
Because another thing that became clear to me is that we assume that data or information or solid information, whatever you want to call it, is infallible and actually will change minds and should change minds. I haven't found that to be true.
No, actually, studies have shown that when you contradict someone's belief system with facts, that their defenses go up, their skepticism goes up, their antibodies basically come out, and they try to find ways to rationalize those facts or dismiss those facts as fake news or whatever, or explain them away as edge cases, that they actually come out of a conversation where you have attempted to persuade them with facts to change their mind about something they already believe in. They usually come out of those conversations more firmly believing what
Yeah.
they started the conversation.
I love the analogy to the immune system because that sort of violence of reaction, that sort of blood rushing to your face, the
Mm.
anger, and that happens. We all understand that happens. And we all understand that it's happening today writ large in the politics that are happening in 2025 in the United States. And all of us are beginning to realize that data isn't perceived the same way everyone.
Yeah.
And then there's the other side of this, which is my experiences from early stage startups. And I know you have some experience there too.
Yeah.
In that case, data may not be the thing that is the right thing to pay attention to, regardless, because you're trying to do something brand new.
Right. If you're trying to invent something, then requests from existing customers who never seen such a thing are not going to be all that relevant.
Yeah, it's the Ford and the horses thing. Customers would have asked for a faster horse. And I also think that there are reward systems that happen there because the second that VCs or investors give a founder money, they are validating the strongly held opinions that founder has, and that the only way to deal with that is to show them what they want and then try something different. You can't tilt against that windmill of validation with $1 million.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes I have found a way occasionally to engender a little bit more empathy for alternative opinions among executive teams. One of them is to become the translator, and that is to listen to multiple opinions and to try to summarize each seemingly contradictory, irreconcilable opinion and try to explain it myself in a positive light. Try to say, so actually, I think you both have a point. You're saying that this is so because of this and this, and you're saying that is so because of these other things. And it might actually be that you're that both things are true in some way, but that they represent different ways of approaching a common problem. Is there an underlying problem here that you're both trying to solve? And then I get them trying to examine themselves, both sides of the coin, rather than me having to propose a compromise.
Fundamentally, I think what we are in the kinds of roles that we have is translators. And first, in the early stages of our careers, we try to translate between business and dev, or
Right.
business and sales, or business and sales and dev, to try to get everybody working together and understand the big vision for the product in the case of product management, or also translate between customers or users in the case of UX in
Yep.
business and dev. And the interesting thing that starts to happen, or happened to me as I got more senior, was that translation role started to face all up
Yeah.
and translating amongst
Yeah.
instead of translating between.
Yeah.
And I realized that I've been part of like 85 teams because I've been working with early stage startups for 20 years. I started to realize that they were all having conversations, all these teams were having conversations that they were never getting to the end of because they were using language they were familiar with and words that they assume they all define in the same way. I have
Right.
one example of institutional investor, and they were all talking about that, but nobody, it turns out
Yeah,
after
define
4
that.
days, we realized nobody was defining that the same. I know you have some stories too. Do you have
Yeah.
stuff like that?
Often. And I As a consultant like you, I come into companies from the outside, and one of the things that's really useful is for them to recognize that they have to explain themselves to me because I don't know anything. I just
Right.
got here, and so what's the context? And they start explaining, ideally, things to me in front of each other. And I start asking a whole lot of clarifying questions. And I point out if I hear people using the same words in what seem like slightly different ways. You said that customers want this, and you said, no, I totally disagree. Our best customers want that. And I'm like, okay, customers broadly and our best customers, that's actually different. Can we define our terms? When you say our best customers, who are you talking about? And maybe they've never actually gone through an exercise to identify their ideal customer profile or to segment out different parts of their customer base. And then we enter into that conversation.
And I want to pause here because we were talking earlier, and my persona for this podcast is somebody who is becoming more senior and realizing that they can't stay out of politics anymore and need some practical ways to do that. I want to point out here that there is a big difference between you or I as book authors coming into a room full of executives and say,
Yeah.
explain it to me, versus someone who is trying to do that from under, meaning you're in the organization and you're lower on the org chart. And coming into, first of all, even getting some time in front of them is one thing, but then also playing dumb
Yeah.
is tricky and
Yeah.
politically sensitive for you too.
And if you're brand new to the organization, it's a little easier. But if you've been there for 5 years, then yeah, playing dumb is definitely trickier. It is possible to still say, I need to understand, I need clarification to when someone, the classic example for a lot of practitioners, I think, is you get a feature request or a UX change request that is explained in the way of a customer asked for it or wants it, or we need it for a deal, or other forms of just do it. And it's important, I think, in order to get the right result, that we ask a lot of why questions. There's the classic five level,
Five whys.
right?
Yeah.
And sometimes executives are impatient with that. Sometimes they're like, look, I've already had the conversation with the customer. Just do it, will you? But I think it's really important to start asking questions like, okay, I just want to make sure that we get it right. So can you tell me a little bit more about what the desired result is for the customer or for the business? So that we have the right acceptance criteria, so that we design it for the proper intended use. And you can usually get some reasonable cooperation on that. Although sometimes they will admit that they don't actually know the answers to all those questions because they got it from a third party because and so you then have hopefully permission to take the worry off of their plate and go talk to the source yourself.
Yeah. A strategy I use there often is to give them the answers and say, can you clarify these for me? And that way they can blame me for the confusion while escalating it above. So to my boss or the person I report, whatever it is, I'll say, I think what I heard you saying is that we need a 20% increase in widgets over the next 6 months. I'm probably not quite right. Then they can send it to their boss, my grand boss, to get clarification rather than being put on the hook. Like, so there's little tricky,
Oh,
sneaky.
this is a great technique, actually. When you feel like there is no strategy or that it's completely unclear, or that you get a different answer every time you ask somebody different on the executive team, it puts you in a really difficult situation because you don't know how to make decisions on your team in your practice. If every time you ask who is our ideal customer, you get a different answer, then who are you designing for? Who are you prioritizing for? Who are you building for? So an answer to that, as you just suggested, is you could put out a draft. You
Mhm.
could say, I've talked to everybody. I've talked to a bunch of customers too. And my guess is that this is the definition that we should be going with. It's a work in progress. Can you help me? Can you weigh in? Can you clarify? Can you add your perspective on this?
You can also blame it on someone else. You can say, I was sitting in a meeting the other day and one of the devs said something interesting. They said that we're looking for a 20% increase in widgets over the next 6 months. And that doesn't jive with what I thought. I'm just curious if I
Yeah.
missed something, or it's not to throw anybody under the bus.
Well,
Um,
I think that's important.
no,
You don't want to make a scapegoat somewhere and potentially make an enemy somewhere either. Or the answer you don't want from your boss is when you say I'm getting contradictory inputs from multiple executives is for them to just say, I'll handle it with Steve. Do what I say. Because that's probably not going to actually drive alignment. Maybe your boss is better at driving alignment than you are, but maybe not. So it's liable to come up again.
yeah. I realize that, and in talking to you, it's making it clear. I operate and suggest everyone operate as if not only the alignment, but the business goals, the clarity on exactly what we're trying to do with this project right now do not exist. And
Yeah,
the way I talk about this is that people write them down, they change, and it's no, it's suicide in a C-level meeting to raise your hand and say, I think our goals have shifted and I don't know what they are. Really powerful leaders would do that, but not all of us are bold
right.
enough to do that. And so if that's the case, if you, the person seeking seniority, go through your day assuming everyone's assuming the goals are clear and that the goals are absolutely not clear and that you have to operate this way without calling anybody out on it. It can help inform because we're product people, right? So we're good at getting users to understand what we need them to understand or do what we
Right.
need them to do. It becomes an interesting puzzle if you just assume the goals don't exist and therefore nothing can be clear.
That's interesting. Where do you go from there? What are the consequences of that way of thinking?
The consequences of that way of thinking is that instead of, I tell the story that I used to walk around thinking if I just asked the right executive at the right time what the goal was, they would tell me. And I
Yeah.
had facepalm moment where I realized they don't know either.
Yeah.
So it takes me out of whining mode, which I think we all are in a lot, where we complain to each other about people not listening to UX, about people ignoring roadmaps and product, people not listening to product managers. And we get in this echo chamber of why aren't they listening to us, which we
Right.
have been doing. I'm old as the hills. We've been doing this since the early 2000s, late 90s,
Oh, at least that long.
at least that long, if not
Yeah.
longer. And
Mythical Man Month came out in the 70s.
you guys should look that up if you don't know what that is. I'm not even sure I remember what that is anymore.
Oh, that's a book about software development at IBM that figured out scientifically that if you add the premise of the book is if you add more people to a project that's late in order
Ah,
to try to get it done faster, it gets later.
it's the 9 women can't have a baby in 1 month
Right.
problem. Yeah, and see what I just did there? I just admitted that I didn't remember exactly what Mythical Man Month was. It doesn't have to be super painful to do it, if you can get over yourself. So that's part of what I guess I just modeled that kind of interaction.
Willingness to be vulnerable. Yes.
Willingness to be vulnerable and giving somebody else a chance to be the one who helps, and
You
people
know,
think helping.
this is a really good point that I think is powerful that it might seem scary at first, but that is really highly leveraged no matter where you're placed in the organization. When you demonstrate the behavior you are looking for from others, they tend to follow your lead, even if you're super junior. When the situation gets heated in an argument and you maintain your cool, it's more likely that it will de-escalate. If you reflect back the the vehemence that you're hearing from other people, it's only going to escalate. But so the opposite is true too. If you are willing to admit what you don't know, other people will feel more safe admitting what they don't know. And then you're actually able to focus on facts, knowing which ones are facts and which ones are opinions. If you if you say, you know what, we really should ask customers because we really don't know the answer, there's a greater willingness to go along with that. It just takes the bluster and the politics, it feels to me, out of lots of situations if you lead by example.
And I think that was another defining moment in my career where I realized that if I was confused, I'm a smart cookie, I think quickly. If I'm confused, I am not the only one who's confused. And so I started to understand, and maybe this is something to understand. As you get more senior, notice that if you ask more basic questions, someone always comes up to you after that meeting and says, "I'm so glad you asked." I always assume that somebody is going to say, "I'm so glad you asked." So there was one client I had that's a big startup that everybody's heard of. And I walked into this senior executive meeting and I said, "I'm pretty sure that the business goals aren't clear." And the pushback I got from the CEO is, "Yes, they are. We have them down to the last." And I said, "I don't think that everybody out there," and this was a long document with OKRs that were like
Yeah.
very detailed, objectives and key results. I said, "I don't think everybody there is clear on them." And this guy pushed back hard. The CEO of the company that had hired me as a consultant said, "You're wrong. You're barking up the wrong tree. You need to stop this line of questioning." And finally, I just said, "Okay." And I was inwardly terrified. But I walked out of that meeting and at least 2 other senior
Mm.
execs were like, "You're totally right."
Yep.
And that was defining too. It's scary,
Yeah.
but if you're confused, you're not the only one. If as a translator, if we
And
really are translators,
to be fair to executive teams everywhere, goals are hard.
goals
They're
are hard.
hard to get right. They're hard to get agreement on. It's hard to know if you actually have agreement on them or people are just saying, yeah, fine to get out of the meeting. It's all of this is hard. I've worked with companies that have no goals, that they've not written them down. They're just like, we don't believe in that. We're agile. And I worked with this one company that they shared their PDF of their OKRs with me, and it was 200 pages.
Oh my god.
And they only had 200 employees.
It's one for each person.
That's how they looked at it.
If like there's
Everybody should
one of
have at least 3 OKRs of their own, all up and down the hierarchy. And I said, "Okay, so how do you use this document?" And they looked at each other and had to admit that they don't. They just go through a weeks-long exercise to set the OKRs at the beginning of the quarter, and then they breathe a sigh of relief, put them aside, and they don't even review them at the end of the quarter. They just come up with new ones.
yeah.
So it was obviously not doing them any good. So the sweet spot is obviously somewhere in the middle, but it's hard to get it right. A lot of executive teams struggle to get it right. A lot of executive teams spend 2 or 3 days at an offsite in a quarter trying to get to alignment. And as you said earlier, never quite finishing the conversation.
And David Service, who's listening in, says the number of headaches I've gotten over "we're agile."
Yeah,
I
right.
know. And by the way, nobody's agile. Everybody's agile fall. Like they
Yeah.
start out saying, and by the way, isn't agile supposed to be 2 coders sitting next to each other writing throwaway code? Nobody
Right.
does that.
Nobody does that.
Nobody does that. So I called this session, this conversation with you. Sometimes you have to let it break. And given a couple of examples, and I would love for you to tell a couple of those stories to people listening, because these are really what you went through that led you to the aha
Yeah.
moment.
There was this one particular company I worked with where the job was to help them adopt OKRs. And I think some of the members of the executive team were skeptical, but there were a couple who were dead set on making it happen. And the others decided, okay, we'll go along. How bad can it be? And we had the first executive team meeting where for a couple of days we hammered at trying to put together some OKRs. And in some respects, they did a good job. Like I insisted that the things that they were working on were in fact measurable and important and that they laddered up to a vision that they were trying to achieve. And so in some ways they followed the form pretty well. But at the end of the first day, they had 7 OKRs for the company executive level. And they only had actually 8 executives. So they almost had 1 per function. And I said, guys, this is too many. The guideline is you shouldn't have for any given team, and you as the executives are a team, you shouldn't have more than 3 at a time. And that's the advanced level too. They basically dismissed my concerns. They said, no, this is right. We're aligned. This is good. This is more aligned than we've been in ages. So we're happy. And I said, I think you're going to struggle. This feels unfocused to me. And they said, nope, we think it's fine. Lo and behold, at the end of the quarter, they had achieved something like 23% on average of their OKRs, of these 7 OKRs. So they came back to the table and I didn't have to say, I told you so. They said, okay, you told us. And They wagged their finger at me and told me that I should have insisted on a smaller number. And I learned from that. Actually, I adjusted my style and I became more directive. And I challenged them to get down to 3. They got down to 4. Okay, an improvement. And they did actually improve in their execution. They got a higher percentage, but still less than half. Gradually, over the next 2 years, they got better and better at aligning. And they got, during our last year of working together, they got down to 1 shared OKR across the entire executive team for per quarter. What was really interesting was a few things had to happen for that to occur. One was the OKRs needed to become cross-functional. They were originally pretty much departmental.
Yeah.
Marketing will produce this many MQLs, sales will close this percentage of deals, stuff like that. And then they became ultimately they ended up focusing on customer referenceability. They wanted customers to be happy and successful such that they were willing to help bring on the next crop of customers.
Yeah, this is why the alignment persona stuff so we're talking about the problem and solutions, right? And the solution that I eventually came up with as a personas person was getting them to collaboratively create alignment personas that change the language so that their goal would then become, if we don't make Roberto ridiculously happy, we're not going to hit our goal of reducing subscription cancellations by 20%.
Exactly, exactly. That forced conversations that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It forced harder decisions that they shied away from making most of the time, because while we're working on the marketing objectives, why is engineering even listening? But
Right.
while we're working on customer satisfaction, uptime and reliability matter, as well as messaging to the customer base, as well as the support response time. All of these things from all these departments matter and contribute to customer referenceability.
Actually, you just saying that made me realize something. We're It does make the engineer also listen, and maybe it's because of something we usually complain about, which is that everybody thinks they know the user.
Right.
And so I think capitalizing on that by changing the conversation to names for users, right, sparks that thing that usually bugs us, which is that the engineer thinks he knows what the user wants. It sparks that so that we can do the primary job. I'm saying this, I think I agree with it. One of our primary jobs is to let them show each other they're misaligned. So in your case of 7 OKRs, what I hear is that they were saying this is so much better than what we've ever been, that it's plenty. And then you had
It
it.
was a positive step, and it started them on a path.
Yeah.
You know, I did have that moment in that first session where maybe I need to really insist.
Yeah.
And I resisted doing that because they kept saying, no, it'll be fine. And they really weren't listening to me. So, as you said, I decided the only way they were really going to take on board and internalize that they needed to prioritize, that they needed to focus, was if they could see the results of lack of focus.
That's the thing.
And we had a way to measure it. We knew that they only got 23% of achievement of their objectives.
You're never going to get to perfection the first time. And I think it's also the whole teachable moment, empathic listening, learning about those things and recognizing in retrospect, sure, you could have pushed for it. But I think probably a big part of you knew they're not ready to go. You're not going to get them there with just talking.
No, they needed to see it for themselves. They
They
needed
need
to
to
come
see it
back.
for themselves.
And I told them that afterward. I said, if I had insisted, I don't think you'd have believed me. In fact, I tried to insist and you didn't believe me. So they gradually learned the lesson. There were a couple of interesting fights along the way that I think had been waiting to happen for a long time.
Yes.
And that having this process, putting them through this process together, forced to the surface. One of them was they disagreed, we talked about this earlier, on who was the ideal customer that they were really going to focus on. Sales and marketing wanted the widest possible bucket. They saw lots of opportunity and they didn't want to narrow the field and have fewer at bats, if you will, fewer opportunities to make a deal. And they were putting pressure on product and engineering to make all of those customers happy. And at the point that they were debating can we use customer satisfaction as our sole goal? The product team stood up and said, based on our current customer base, no, we cannot make all of them referenceable. The product just doesn't have some of the features that they all need, and they're not going to get there. And some people were pointing the finger at product and engineering and saying, fill the gaps already. That's your job. And they were saying, it's too big a job. It's impossible. We cannot serve everybody. We're falling down trying. So we need to focus. And so there was this huge disagreement. It turned out that sales and marketing both felt that they could not make their numbers
Right.
with a narrower field. But product and engineering also felt that they could not make their numbers with a broad field. So once we got all of that on the table, it seemed, oh, we as an executive team have collectively set ourselves up for failure because we looked at these things individually in silos, in functional areas. We missed the fact that we have set up a contradictory, mutually contradictory, impossible to solve formula for ourselves.
Yeah. And Melissa talked about this some too. I think it's so interesting because then the language problems go even deeper. Even the language you use for talking about your own organization or even the org structure of your org chart automatically puts conflicts into place. This is also that Conway's
Yeah.
law, right? That you, by definition, the organizational structure will end up impacting the communication, which will impact the product. It can't not. And so being a change agent often means coming in and saying that I don't understand what this really basic word is,
Yeah.
like responsible for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like and coming again, granted, coming in as a consultant who already has a reputation is very different. And I think has to be handled, you have to handle it differently if you're coming up from underneath, but you
Yeah.
can start to chip away at it a little bit.
Maybe Melissa talked about this. We have this framework in the book called the DACY framework. We didn't make it up. We
Is it like
discovered
rate?
it's like RACI, more specifically applies to decision making.
Okay.
And so the D is the driver of a decision, really the ultimate owner of the decision. The A is the approver, somebody higher placed in the organization who is going to hopefully just rubber stamp the decision, but that could be an escalation point if there's just massive disagreement on this. The driver agrees on the criteria for a good decision and then delegates the decision to the driver. The others are consulted. That's the same as in RACI, and informed. That's the same as in RACI as well. And the whole idea is to set up a situation where most decisions are owned by a person or a role, and everybody knows that's their decision. What goes into the backlog and in what order is the product manager's decision. But can they make that kind of decision completely on their own with no input from anywhere? No, that's silly. Sales has an opinion, engineering has an opinion, design has an opinion, support has an opinion. So along with the authority to make a decision, they are required to consult with a set of stakeholders. That's where the C comes in, who have a stake in the results or who have good information that would result in a better decision. So it's not designed by committee. It's not an attempt to get consensus. One person in the end still makes the decision, but it does require that discussion. And it turns out there's this psychological trick going on that we don't always think about, which is if you ask other people to be involved in a decision, to help you develop that decision, even when in the end you disagree with them and go with a different option, they're more willing to stand behind it because you took the time to ask and to listen.
100%. And I think there's another genius piece of this, right? So if I keep bringing up like the difference of doing it from within than from without, something like a DACY chart or a RACI chart or another fundamental business tool like creating goals for a project or anything like that, it's good to have a bunch of those in your backpack.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult for your boss to say that a RACI chart is pointless. These fundamental business school diagrams or charts or fill in the blanks or whatever can often be a great thing because it's very hard to say this is pointless if you are a boss.
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Or if you say that we already know who's responsible and accountable, then you can still say, that's awesome. Maybe can we put it into this chart so I can share it with my team so they won't get confused? You're so brilliant. You can keep it in your head. I need to translate it for my team so that they won't be confused.
This is a really good technique. You said earlier that it's hard to play dumb, but one way that you can make it a little safer to play dumb is to say to an executive, hey, you are so knowledgeable about this. You're so deep into this. You've been here forever. This is your baby, and I get it. And you say that things are obvious, but I don't think it's obvious to everyone.
That's it.
They don't have the benefit of all of the experience that you have. And so could we take some time to pull that stuff out of you and get it on paper?
That's it. That's it.
There's
Pull out your brilliance and translate it so these other lower entities can understand. No, blowing smoke in this way is a huge tool of mine. I will even tell people in the beginning of a workshop that sometimes I blow smoke. And then 30 minutes later, I'll say to them, I shouldn't even say this out loud. I'll say to them, wow, you are getting this faster than any other team I've worked with. And they're like,
you told them, but nonetheless, it still works.
it still works. So David Service has put in a couple comments. Siloing seems to be the challenge of not seeing the forest for the trees as an organization. Departments becoming more narrowly incentives driven rather than having the common goals you've been mentioning.
Yeah.
And then the follow on is, I'd be curious to learn more about how you've combated the form of organizational entropy in the past. Maybe this is your person standing up and crossing out 2 OKRs.
Oh, yeah. So this was a dramatic demonstration of that lack of alignment at the point that this same company that we're talking about had gotten down to 4 OKRs. This is the point where they had, for the first time, really attempted to focus and compromise rather than just everybody having their own piece on the game board. Well, I was a little bit worried about how aligned they were. So I took a poll at the end. I was like, how happy are you all individually with this result? And everybody signed on, said, it's great, no worries. One of the executives went directly from that meeting to a meeting with all of their directors, their direct reports. And they asked, how did the meeting go? And he said, we came up with these 4 OKRs. And then before anybody could say anything, he crossed 2 of them out and said, don't worry about these 2, ignore them. We don't have time or ability to execute on them.
So this was after, wait a second. So the whole senior team came up with 4, and then one of them wrote up the 4 and crossed 2 out in a different meeting?
In a different meeting, not with any of the other executives, just with their team. And the only reason I know is I had a mole in that meeting who reported to me, he started texting me as the discussion was happening. And I had to call him on that. I had a talk with him the next day and I said, WTF? And he said, he admitted that he did not feel safe disagreeing with the majority in that conversation, that he didn't want to be the one who was seen as not a team player. And everybody eventually did find out that happened through one conversation or another. And they were all mad at him, but it really wasn't just him. It really, maybe he should have had more courage or whatever. But obviously the situation was difficult and not safe and supportive for people to say things that they thought honestly, because he really didn't think they could execute. And he was right. They really needed to get further down in the focus funnel. So they did eventually take that as a lesson of we can't do everything.
I mean, this is so human. And I think another point of aha moment in your career as you become more senior is that you realize that having a C in front of your name or VP or whatever doesn't automatically make you smart. It also doesn't automatically make you an idiot, although sometimes it seems to. But the problems that people are having communicating in the heady air of the executive team are the same problems you had on the playground, are the same problems you have with your spouse, are the same problems you have with your friend groups when you try to decide to go out to dinner.
Yeah.
It's not magically solved. The human interaction problems are not magically solved. That means that trauma passes down through generations, passes down the org chart, and the lack of safety there then becomes a lack of safety farther on because the people who are in that person's meeting now suddenly are ignoring 2 of the goals, which could get them in trouble with another senior executive. And Steve says, not obvious to our mere mortals. Can we interview you to pull it out of you? Brilliant. Yes. If you start, that's the other reason I like the Greek gods thing. The Greek gods are nuts and petulant and like toddlers because they are extreme representations
Of
of
us.
humans.
Right.
And there is power in not necessarily looking down on that, but saying, okay, now I understand that there are different motivations here and different struggles here that aren't what they look like from the result. The
That's
lightning is from something else.
There's always stuff that you don't know that's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
You discover that somebody is dealing with a sick spouse at home partway through the process, and they're just stressed out, and
Yeah.
so they're snapping. Or you discover that the CEO has changed their strategy 3 times or seems to be now suddenly pushing harder on short-term things because they're getting pressure from the board to make some numbers. You discover these things over time, but they're not obvious, and sometimes people don't feel safe telling you, or there's some M&A going on and they actually can't tell you.
They can't tell you.
And
Yeah. That was the story with Mike Neff a couple of weeks ago that the next one I'm going to post, which is the motivation of the senior person in the organization was taking the company public, but nobody else knew that. And
Mm,
so the product team was doing the very best they could for the product, but it didn't matter. In fact, it wasn't even wanted because that wasn't what was driving
right.
the CEO. I also
Oh,
have something that I like to say a lot, which is a great indicator that there is infighting in an executive team is that they're hiring another senior person.
yeah, yeah,
And that actually, the trickle down from that is that they should hire a consultant for temporarily instead to try to get rid of that alignment issue. But
right.
adding another senior voice
It's just gonna
into
make
an
it worse.
existing argument never solves it.
Yeah, it's if adding engineers makes late projects later, adding executives makes misalignment less aligned.
Oh my God, we have to create a big infographic at that.
The
I'll put your face next to it or something.
the mythical, magical executive, something like that.
The mythical, magical, manipulative, misanthropic executive.
Right.
Um, Tell us more about when we talked before. I said, well, what do you want people to know
Mhm.
coming through this? And you said something interesting. Let's share that with us.
What I was saying at the time was, how important getting to alignment is to unblock progress so that we can stop trying to go in all different directions and go together faster in one direction. I think a lot of people, including me at times, just felt like it's hopeless. Like
Yeah.
you talk to 6 people about strategy and you get 6 different answers, and you can't make the decisions that you need to make in your job as a result. You think it's above your pay grade and you don't know what's going on with these people. And it's just tempting to put your blinders on and just work on your work. But you can't make the right decisions in your work. And ultimately, the company will not benefit, will not go where you want it to go. And your career as a result will not go where you want it to go. But it's tempting because it feels hard. And I guess my ultimate message is over time, I've discovered that it is possible to make change. This executive team that I was telling you about got down to 1 OKR. They had some bumps along the way. They needed to have some uncomfortable fights, but they came through those and resolved them. The definition of the ICP that they were going after was not as narrow as the product team wanted, not as broad as the marketing team wanted, but they came up with one that was a compromise between the two. And the result was transformative for them. Their numbers started to turn around. That's important. But more importantly, being on that executive team became a much better experience for all of them. They did change a couple of the team members along that 2-year journey that were not fully on board, that were more focused on their silo than they were on the company as a whole. So sometimes that's necessary, but sometimes that's possible also. And the shortest path to recognizing when you've got to change either the objectives or the process or the team is to force this stuff to the surface.
And speaking of forcing it to the surface, one of the big problems with being interested in alignment for 15 years, which I have been, is that nobody's shopping for it. It's
Yeah.
a problem that everybody has. And they're 4 inches away from saying, oh, yeah, I get that now. But that's not what they're shopping for. What's your experience with that? What are you seeing out there?
I agree. Nobody has ever said, we need you to come in and help us align the executive team. What they do say is, we need a roadmap, or we need a strategy session, or we need some help organizing. I'm working with this company right now where the two companies of almost the same size are merging, and they're looking for an outsider to help them do org design. And I get that. They want a neutral party, if you will, but really they already know who the new CEO is going to be. They already know some of the key players. They could do this together if they were willing to really disagree openly with each other, I think. So they often the companies will hire me or other consultant and coaches for something that seems very concrete and discrete and what I would call an end of pipe solution. We
Mm.
need to produce a roadmap. We need to produce a strategy. We need to produce a new org chart. But the only reason they can't do it themselves is because of this underlying lack of alignment.
Okay, so I want to throw this into your lap. Everybody in our field is so worried about ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. With artificial intelligence, I think you just answered it, but artificial intelligence is never going to solve this problem, in my
No,
opinion. Now, it
no.
may take a while for our industry to realize that this is part of the job description now, and they need to hire people who are good at alignment. But I don't think ChatGPT could ostensibly come up with the perfect roadmap, but it's never going to be perfect. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. There might be an answer that's a logical extrapolation of the facts that you feed into it.
Yeah.
But there's two fundamental problems with that. One is, it would be impossible to invent anything new that way because it's all just incrementally adding to what already exists, right? If you're going to change the paradigm, you're not going to get that out of, if you're going to be disruptive, you're not going to get that out of the way LLMs work. But the more fundamental problem, and the one that we're talking about here, is you could also ask it to come up with 3 options, and all of them would seem logical and valid and
Yep.
like good ideas, but you can't do all of them. So how do we choose?
And
There's
it doesn't stop the argument that's inevitable in 3 weeks. When somebody comes in and says, I just met somebody who told me it needs to be more blue.
Yeah. or it's missing the XYZ feature, or
Exactly. Or the market has changed. There's always a way around data, around the
right.
right or wrong answer. Daniel says he's reading a line from Bruce and well worth the read. Love the framework along this with the storytelling, makes it an easy and interesting read. Totally,
Thanks, Daniel.
totally agree. So speaking of your own genius and work, where can people find you? What are you going to do next?
Oh, you can find more on my company, Product Culture, at productculture.com. We have a weekly, what I call a nano letter that is about, it's called One Thing on Product Culture. And the reason it's called a nano letter is it's so short, literally you don't have to scroll, that it's faster to read it than to put it in a folder of things that you mean to read that you never read.
And you're doing a lot of speaking and workshops, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. All around the world. I'm speaking at conferences and product tanks. We just announced I'm going to be speaking at Productized in Portugal, in Lisbon, in the
Ooh.
fall. My co-author, Melissa, is speaking at the Business of Software early next month in the UK. So you'll have a hard time missing us.
Yeah. And everybody, if you have not yet listened to my earlier interview with Melissa Appel, Bruce's co-author, please go do that. I want to thank you so much, Bruce, for all of your time today and all of the great insights you shared, and for bringing this conversation to the fore in our industries. At first, I was sad because I wanted to do it. Now I'm glad because you're doing all the heavy lifting and the rest of us can just benefit from that. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. My pleasure. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Corporate Underpants, and there's lots more to come. If you have any projects that you need my help on, if you're interested in coaching to become a senior product leader through understanding alignment in politics, or if you're interested in any of the classes or books that I'm developing, please visit my website, adlininc.com, and get in touch.